My neighbor called the police and CPS claiming I kidnapped my white daughter because I'm black. I got her arrested instead. Me and my daughter Lily moved into our new neighborhood in April after my wife passed away from cancer. It was just me and my 7-year-old trying to start fresh in a place where everything didn't remind us of her mom. The house was perfect. Had a big backyard for Lily to play in, good schools nearby, and a park down the street. All the neighbors seemed friendly enough when we moved in, waving from their driveways and welcoming us to the street. Everyone except Nancy from 2 houses down. The first time she saw me and Lily together, she literally stopped walking her dog and stared. Lily ran up to pet the dog, and Nancy yanked it away, asking Lily where her parents were. I walked over and said I was her dad, and Nancy looked at me, looked at Lily, who inherited her mom's blonde hair and blue eyes, then looked back at me and said, "Sure you are." I thought she was joking, but she was dead serious. After that, Nancy made it her mission to watch everything we did. If Lily was playing in our front yard, Nancy would stand at her window taking pictures. When I'd walk Lily to the bus stop, Nancy would follow us from across the street, pretending to check her mail for 10 minutes. The other neighbors thought Nancy was just being nosy, but I knew exactly what her problem was. Then things got worse. Lily had a play date with her friend Zoe, and Nancy called Zoe's mom asking if she knew the real story about the black man claiming to be Lily's father. Zoe's mom told me about it and said Nancy warned her I was probably dangerous. I confronted Nancy and told her to stop spreading lies. She said she was just looking out for that poor little girl who was obviously in danger. I showed her pictures of me and my wife at the hospital when Lily was born. Nancy said anyone could fake photos these days. 2 weeks later, I was at home working when 3 police cars pulled up. They said they got a call about a kidnapped child being held at my address. Nancy had called saying she witnessed a black man force a crying white child into the house. Lily was at school. I showed the cops my ID, Lily's birth certificate I kept in my desk, family photos all over the house. They apologized and said they had to follow up on all calls. This happened 4 more times over the next month. Nancy would call whenever she saw me with Lily. The cops got tired of it real quick and told Nancy she needed to stop making false reports, but she kept doing it anyway. The breaking point was when Nancy called CPS, saying I was trafficking my daughter. A social worker showed up at Lily's school and pulled her out of class to interview her. Lily came home crying, asking why someone wanted to take her away from me. That's when I decided Nancy needed to learn her lesson. I found out Nancy worked as a realtor and had just listed the biggest house in her career, some mansion worth $2 million. She was hosting an open house that Sunday for all the rich potential buyers. I made some calls to people from our old neighborhood and invited them to check out Nancy's open house. My former neighbors included my brother-in-law Terrell and his white wife Amy with their mixed kids, my friend Kenji and his black wife Rochelle with their adopted white daughter, and our old neighbor Luis with his very pale twin boys. We all showed up at different times during the open house. Each family made Nancy visibly uncomfortable. She kept asking how we heard about the listing and if we were really interested in buying. Then she'd make comments about how the neighborhood might not be a good fit for our families. Kenji recorded her telling him the area wasn't very diverse and his daughter might feel isolated. She told Luis his boys would probably prefer a more urban school district. She told Terrell that some neighbors might have issues with mixed families. But the best part was when Mr. Ben Hutchinson showed up. He was the owner of the mansion and had come to see how the open house was going. He was also black. Nancy didn't know this because they'd only talked on the phone, and his wife Janet, who's white, had handled all the in-person meetings. When Mr. Ben Hutchinson introduced himself, Nancy went pale. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He stepped forward from the crowd of potential buyers, his hand extended toward Nancy. She took it automatically, her professional smile frozen on her face, while her eyes showed pure panic. Mr. Hutchinson gestured toward the grand staircase, away from the remaining visitors, who were pretending to admire the crown molding, but clearly listening to every word. Nancy followed him, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and I stayed near the entrance where I could see everything unfold. Mr. Hutchinson's voice carried just enough for me to catch phrases about neighborhood fit and diversity concerns. Nancy's face shifted from pale to bright red as she realized he'd heard her comments to my friends. She started talking fast, her hands moving in quick gestures, words tumbling out about misunderstandings and context, and how things sounded worse than she meant them. A couple in designer suits exchanged glances and headed for the door without a word. Another family gathered their kids and made excuses about needing to see other properties. Within 5 minutes, the open house had cleared out, except for Nancy, Mr. Hutchinson, and me standing by the entrance. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Kenji's text showed a video file with a message that just said, "Got it all." I opened the clip and watched Nancy telling him his daughter might feel isolated in a neighborhood that wasn't very diverse. The audio was crystal clear, her voice unmistakable. This wasn't just gossip or hearsay anymore. This was solid evidence of Nancy violating fair housing laws, recorded in her own words while representing a property for sale. Mr. Ed Hutchinson walked back toward me while Nancy stood frozen by the staircase. He asked for my contact information, pulling out his phone to save my number. His voice was calm, but I could see the anger in his jaw, the way he kept his words carefully controlled. He told Nancy they needed to have a serious conversation about her conduct and his listing agreement, then walked out the front door without waiting for her response. I followed him out, feeling Nancy's eyes burning into my back. The drive home took 20 minutes but felt like 5. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, satisfaction mixing with nervousness about what came next. Nancy would figure out I'd orchestrated the whole thing. She'd know I'd invited those specific families to expose her racism. The question was, what she'd do about it. Lily was safe at Zoe's house for a sleepover, which suddenly felt like perfect timing. Whatever happened next, at least my daughter wouldn't be home to see it. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a minute, letting the reality sink in. I'd just blown up Nancy's biggest career opportunity. She'd lose that listing for sure, maybe face professional consequences beyond that. Part of me felt guilty for going that far, but then I remembered Lily crying after the CPS interview, asking why someone wanted to take her away from me. That memory burned away any guilt I might have felt. My phone rang around 7 that night while I was heating up leftover pizza. Mr. Hutchinson's name showed on the screen. He thanked me for exposing Nancy's true character before he trusted her with the biggest sale of his life. His wife had always handled the in-person meetings, so he'd never met Nancy face-to-face until today. He said he was terminating their contract right away and planned to file a discrimination complaint with the state real estate board. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but I could hear the disappointment in his voice. He'd hired Nancy based on her reputation and sales record, never imagining she'd sabotage her own deal with racist comments. After we hung up, I finished my pizza and tried to watch TV, but my mind kept racing through possible scenarios. Nancy would be furious. She'd lost a huge commission and probably her professional reputation. I'd accomplished what I set out to do, but now I had to live 2 houses down from someone whose life I'd just destroyed. The next morning, I was making pancakes when movement outside the kitchen window caught my eye. Nancy was marching up my driveway, her phone clutched in one hand, her face twisted with rage. I turned off the stove and stepped onto the porch before she could ring the doorbell. No way was I letting her wake up the whole neighborhood or create a scene that Lily might hear about later. Nancy stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, breathing hard like she'd run the whole way. She accused me of sabotaging her career, her voice shaking with anger. She said she'd talked to her lawyer and planned to sue me for intentional interference with her business relationships. The words came out fast and sharp, each one meant to cut. I stayed calm, leaning against the porch railing with my arms crossed. I pointed out that I'd simply invited some friends to a public open house. What happened after that was entirely due to her own words and actions. I didn't force her to make those comments about diverse neighborhoods or urban school districts. She chose to say those things, and now she was facing the consequences of her own choices. Nancy's expression shifted, the anger cracking into something that looked almost like desperation. Tears started running down her face, and her voice got quieter, shakier. She said I'd ruined her life over a few misunderstandings, that she was only trying to protect the neighborhood and look out for everyone's safety. The words made my jaw clench. I stepped forward to the edge of the porch and told her that calling the police on my daughter 4 times wasn't protecting anyone. Calling CPS and having Lily pulled out of class wasn't keeping anyone safe. That was racism, pure and simple, and now she was finally facing consequences for terrorizing a 7-year-old girl. Nancy opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. She turned and walked back down the driveway, her shoulders shaking. Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood about what happened at the open house. The woman across the street stopped by with cookies and said she was glad someone finally stood up to Nancy's nosiness. 2 other neighbors came by separately to tell me they'd witnessed Nancy's behavior toward me and Lily for months, and felt bad they hadn't said anything sooner. But not everyone was supportive. The couple 3 houses down gave me cold looks when I waved from my yard. Another neighbor I'd chatted with at the bus stop suddenly found reasons to avoid eye contact. The neighborhood was splitting into camps, and I could feel the tension every time I stepped outside. Lily came home from the school on Wednesday with red eyes and a crumpled permission slip in her backpack. She dropped her bag by the door and told me one of her classmates said their mom told them to stay away from our family because we caused trouble. My daughter asked if we were bad people, if we'd done something wrong. I pulled her onto the couch and tried to explain that sometimes standing up for yourself makes other people uncomfortable, but that didn't mean we were wrong. The words felt hollow even as I said them. Nancy's professional crisis was creating social fallout that was hitting my daughter directly, and I hadn't planned for that. That night after Lily went to bed, Terrell called to warn me about Nancy's latest move. She'd been posting in neighborhood Facebook groups about being targeted and harassed by new residents. She wasn't naming me directly, but the implications were obvious to anyone paying attention. Some people who didn't know the full story were commenting with sympathy, talking about how hard it must be to feel unsafe in your own neighborhood. Terrell said a few people were asking questions, wanting to know both sides, but plenty of others were just accepting Nancy's victim narrative without question. I decided to ignore the Facebook posts and focus on what mattered. But then, Mr. Hutchinson called 3 days later, asking if I'd be willing to provide a written statement for the state real estate licensing board. He said Nancy's behavior violated fair housing laws, and he wanted to make sure there was a formal record of everything she'd done. I agreed without hesitation and spent the next evening at my kitchen table writing down every single incident I could remember. The first time Nancy stopped her dog from letting Lily pet it and asked where her parents were. The surveillance from her window with her phone taking pictures. Following us to the bus stop while pretending to check her mail. Calling Zoe's mom to warn her about the dangerous black man claiming to be Lily's father. All 5 police visits triggered by her false reports. The CPS investigation that pulled Lily out of class and left her crying about being taken away from me. Seeing it all written down in one document made my hands shake because the harassment looked even worse on paper than it had felt living through it. I submitted the statement to Mr. Hutchinson's attorney that Friday morning and tried to move forward with our lives. That weekend, Lily was quieter than usual, playing with her toys in the living room, but not really engaged with them. I asked if she wanted to go to the park, and she just shrugged, which wasn't like her at all. Finally, she looked up at me with those blue eyes that reminded me so much of her mom and asked if we were going to have to move again because people didn't like us here. The question hit me harder than Nancy's confrontation on my porch had. I sat down on the couch next to her and pulled her close, trying to figure out how to explain racism to a 7-year-old who just wanted to play with her friends and feel safe in her own neighborhood. I told her that some people have wrong ideas about other people based on how they look, and that's what happened with Nancy. I explained that standing up for yourself when someone treats you badly is important, but sometimes doing the right thing makes life harder before it gets better. Lily asked if Nancy hated us because of her skin color and mine being different, and I had to say yes while my heart broke a little. She asked if other people thought the same thing Nancy did, and I couldn't lie to her about that either. I told her most people in our neighborhood were good and kind, but there would always be some who had problems with our family, and we couldn't let those people make us run away from the home we'd chosen. She nodded like she understood, but I could see the weight of it settling on her small shoulders. Monday afternoon, I was working from home when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end identified herself as someone from Nancy's real estate firm and said they were calling to inform me that Nancy had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into discrimination allegations. She asked if I'd be willing to provide any additional information or documentation, and I told her everything had been submitted to the state licensing board. After I hung up, I felt this rush of satisfaction that Nancy was finally facing real consequences at work, but it mixed with something uncomfortable when I looked out my front window and saw her house just 2 doors down. I'd essentially declared war on someone who lived on the same street where my daughter played and rode her bike. That evening, Zoe's mom called and started apologizing before I could even say hello. She said another parent had told her I'd orchestrated some kind of elaborate setup to destroy Nancy's career, and she wanted to hear my side of the story directly. I explained the full timeline of Nancy's harassment starting from the first day we moved in, the police visits, the CPS investigation, everything Nancy had put Lily through. Zoe's mom got quiet and then said she was horrified that she'd initially doubted my version of events. She admitted that when the other parent told her about the open house incident, she'd wondered if maybe I'd gone too far in my response to Nancy's nosiness. Now she understood that Nancy's behavior had been targeted harassment based on race, not just being an overly concerned neighbor. She apologized again for not being more supportive earlier and said she'd make sure Zoe understood that Lily's family hadn't done anything wrong. I thanked her and felt some of the tension in my chest ease up, knowing at least one parent understood what we'd been dealing with. 2 days later, I was making dinner when someone knocked on my front door. I opened it to find one of the police officers who'd responded to Nancy's false reports standing on my porch in civilian clothes. He introduced himself properly this time and said he was off duty, but wanted to let me know he'd submitted his own statement to the real estate board, documenting Nancy's pattern of false emergency calls. He said what she did to my family was wrong, and he was glad there were finally consequences, because officers like him had to waste time and resources responding to her racist paranoia instead of handling actual emergencies. He told me he'd been a cop for 15 years and seen too many situations where people weaponized emergency services against black families, and he was tired of it. I shook his hand and thanked him for taking the time to submit a statement, and after he left, I felt like maybe the system was actually working for once. That feeling lasted exactly 2 weeks until a certified letter arrived requiring my signature. The return address showed a law firm I'd never heard of, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Nancy's attorney had sent a formal demand letter threatening legal action for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with business relationships. The letter claimed I'd orchestrated a coordinated harassment campaign against Nancy by bringing multiple families to her open house with the specific intent of humiliating her and destroying her professional reputation. It demanded I pay $50,000 in damages and issue a public apology to Nancy within 10 days or face a lawsuit. I read the letter 3 times trying to process the fact that Nancy was actually trying to sue me after everything she'd done to my family. I immediately called my friend Jessica, who'd gone to law school and now practiced family law in our old neighborhood. She agreed to look at the letter right away and called me back within an hour. Jessica said most of it was intimidation tactics designed to scare me into backing down, but I should take it seriously enough to start documenting everything in case Nancy actually filed a lawsuit. She offered to represent me for a reduced rate since we'd been friends for years, and she said Nancy's attorney was grasping at straws given Nancy's own documented behavior of harassment and false police reports. Jessica told me to gather every piece of evidence I had, including the police reports, the CPS documentation, witness statements from neighbors, and Kenji's video recording from the open house. I spent the rest of the evening pulling together files and making copies of everything, while trying not to think about how much this legal battle might cost, even with Jessica's reduced rate. That night, Lily woke up screaming from a nightmare about being taken away by strangers. I rushed to her room and held her while she cried, and she kept saying she didn't want to leave me and didn't understand why people wanted to separate us. I realized the ongoing conflict with Nancy was re-triggering all the trauma from the CPS investigation when that social worker had pulled her out of class. The next morning, I called the child therapist that Lily's school counselor had recommended months ago and made an appointment for the following week because my daughter's well-being mattered more than winning any battle against Nancy. The therapist's office called back that afternoon saying they'd had a cancellation and could see Lily the next day if we wanted the earlier slot. 3 days after I received Nancy's demand letter, a process server showed up at my door with a restraining order petition. Nancy had filed paperwork claiming I'd been harassing and threatening her, citing the open house incident and my friend's attendance as evidence of a coordinated intimidation campaign against her. The petition described me as aggressive and dangerous, saying she feared for her safety because I'd already demonstrated a willingness to destroy her livelihood and now might escalate to physical violence. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, and I stood in my doorway holding the papers while rage burned through my chest at how Nancy was twisting everything to make herself the victim. I called Jessica immediately, and she said to come to her office the next morning so we could prepare a response. That night, I barely slept, thinking about Nancy's audacity in claiming she was the one being harassed after everything she'd put me and Lily through. Jessica and I spent 4 hours the next day preparing a counter-petition documenting Nancy's year of harassment, the false police reports, and the CPS investigation that had traumatized Lily. We gathered statements from the police officers who'd responded to Nancy's calls, from Zoe's mom about Nancy's phone call spreading lies about me, and from 3 neighbors who'd witnessed Nancy's surveillance behavior and her following us to the bus stop. Jessica said we had a strong case showing that Nancy had engaged in a sustained campaign of racial harassment against my family, and her restraining order petition was just another attempt to weaponize the legal system against us. She filed our counter-petition with the court and sent a copy to Nancy's attorney along with all our supporting documentation. I left Jessica's office feeling slightly better about our legal position, but completely exhausted by the ongoing battle that showed no signs of ending anytime soon. The neighborhood split down the middle after the courthouse drama wrapped up. Some folks stopped making eye contact when I walked to my mailbox or worked in the front yard. They'd suddenly remember something they needed to do inside their houses the second I came outside. Others went totally the opposite direction. The guy 3 doors down started waving every single time he saw me, like we were best friends now. The couple with the German Shepherd made a point of stopping to chat whenever they walked past. It felt weird having people pick sides over something that shouldn't have needed sides in the first place. The woman who lived directly across the street showed up on my porch 2 days after the hearing carrying a plate of chocolate chip cookies. She introduced herself as Margaret and said she'd been living on this street for 15 years. She told me Nancy had been a problem for almost everyone at some point, taking pictures of people's yards if their grass got too long. calling code enforcement if someone left their trash cans out past pickup day, spreading gossip about anyone who didn't fit her idea of how the neighborhood should look. Margaret said she was glad someone finally pushed back hard enough to make Nancy think twice about her behavior. I thanked her for the cookies and felt a little better knowing I wasn't the only person who'd dealt with Nancy's nonsense over the years. 3 weeks crawled by with this new normal settling in around us. Lily seemed okay on the surface, going to the school and doing her homework and playing with her toys. Then her teacher called me at work one afternoon. She said Lily had been really quiet lately, not participating in class discussions like she used to, keeping to herself at recess instead of playing with the other kids. That morning, Lily got into an argument with another student who said their parents told them to stay away from our family because we were troublemakers. The teacher broke it up before it got physical, but Lily spent the rest of the day looking like she might cry. Hearing that made my stomach drop. I'd been so focused on fighting Nancy and proving I was right that I hadn't really looked at what this whole situation was doing to my daughter. Lily wasn't just dealing with Nancy's racism anymore. Now she was dealing with being labeled a troublemaker at the school, losing friends because their parents thought we brought drama to the neighborhood, carrying the weight of a conflict she didn't start and couldn't control. I realized my fight for justice was costing Lily the exact things we moved here to find: safety, belonging, a fresh start away from all the pain of losing her mom. Instead, I dragged her into a different kind of pain, one I created by choosing revenge over peace. The restraining order hearing happened on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I sat at a table with my lawyer while Nancy sat across the aisle with hers. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, just the judge's bench and a few rows of seats and fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and depressing. Nancy took the stand first, and her attorney walked her through her version of events. She talked about feeling unsafe in her own neighborhood because I organized a group of people to humiliate her publicly at her workplace. She described the open house incident like it was a coordinated attack designed to destroy her career and reputation. Her voice shook when she talked about seeing all those families show up one after another, how she felt targeted and harassed, how she couldn't sleep at night knowing I lived just 2 houses away and might escalate things further. Her attorney presented the open house situation as proof that I had a vindictive character and a pattern of retaliation. He argued that someone willing to sabotage another person's livelihood over a misunderstanding might be capable of physical violence next. Nancy cried a little bit when she talked about losing her job and not being able to pay her mortgage. She made it sound like I was some kind of monster who destroyed an innocent woman's life for no reason. My lawyer stood up when it was our turn and started laying out the evidence we'd gathered. She presented copies of every police report from Nancy's false calls about me kidnapping Lily. She showed the judge documentation from the CPS investigation that proved Nancy had lied about me trafficking my daughter. She had written statements from 3 different neighbors who witnessed Nancy following us to the bus stop and standing at her window taking pictures of Lily playing in our yard. She had the statement from Zoe's mom about Nancy calling to spread lies about me being dangerous. Then she played the video Kenji recorded at the open house. The judge leaned forward to watch Nancy telling Kenji that the neighborhood wasn't diverse and his daughter might feel isolated, telling Luis his boys would prefer a more urban school district, telling Terrell that some neighbors might have issues with mixed families. The video showed Nancy saying all those things unprompted, not responding to questions or pressure from anyone. My lawyer pointed out that Nancy's discriminatory comments at the open house weren't caused by my presence or any harassment campaign. They were Nancy revealing her true character to potential homebuyers who happened to be families of color. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to skeptical as the evidence piled up. He started looking at Nancy differently, like he was seeing through her victim story to the reality underneath. The judge took about 5 minutes to make his decision after both sides finished presenting. He denied Nancy's restraining order petition outright. He said the evidence showed a clear pattern of harassment from Nancy toward my family that predated any actions I took at the open house. He noted that attending a public open house with friends wasn't harassment or stalking under any legal definition. Then he warned both of us to stay away from each other going forward. He said this situation had turned into a neighborhood conflict that wasn't serving anyone's interests, especially not the children involved. She presented copies of every police report from Nancy's false calls about me kidnapping Lily. She showed the judge documentation from the CPS investigation that proved Nancy had lied about me trafficking my daughter. She had written statements from 3 different neighbors who witnessed Nancy following us to the bus stop and standing at her window taking pictures of Lily playing in our yard. She had the statement from Zoe's mom about Nancy calling to spread lies about me being dangerous. Then she played the video Kenji recorded at the open house. The judge leaned forward to watch Nancy telling Kenji that the neighborhood wasn't diverse and his daughter might feel isolated, telling Luis his boys would prefer a more urban school district, telling Terrell that some neighbors might have issues with mixed families. The video showed Nancy saying all those things unprompted, not responding to questions or pressure from anyone. My lawyer pointed out that Nancy's discriminatory comments at the open house weren't caused by my presence or any harassment campaign. They were Nancy revealing her true character to potential homebuyers who happened to be families of color. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to skeptical as the evidence piled up. He started looking at Nancy differently, like he was seeing through her victim story to the reality underneath. The judge took about 5 minutes to make his decision, after both sides finished presenting. He denied Nancy's restraining order petition outright. He said the evidence showed a clear pattern of harassment from Nancy toward my family that predated any actions I took at the open house. He noted that attending a public open house with friends wasn't harassment or stalking under any legal definition. Then he warned both of us to stay away from each other going forward. He said this situation had turned into a neighborhood conflict that wasn't serving anyone's interests, especially not the children involved. He suggested we both seriously consider mediation to resolve our issues before things escalated into something worse. He dismissed the case and told us we were free to go. I felt relieved that Nancy didn't get her restraining order, but also exhausted by the whole process. The constant fighting and legal battles and stress had worn me down to nothing. Walking out of the courthouse into the parking lot, I caught Nancy glaring at me from about 50 feet away. Her face had this tight, angry look that told me she wasn't done fighting even though she lost in court. Her lawyer was talking to her, but she wasn't really listening, just staring at me with pure hatred in her eyes. I could see this wasn't over for her. Losing her job wasn't enough punishment in her mind. Losing the court case wasn't enough either. She wanted to keep going until one of us completely destroyed the other, which meant it wasn't over for me and Lily either. We were stuck in this cycle of retaliation and revenge that kept feeding itself, getting bigger and messier with no end in sight. I walked to my car feeling like I won the battle but was losing the war. The victory felt hollow and temporary, like putting a Band-Aid on a wound that needed stitches. That evening I got home around 6 and found Lily sitting on her bed crying. I could hear her from the hallway before I even opened her bedroom door. She had her face buried in her pillow trying to muffle the sound. I sat down next to her and rubbed her back until she looked up at me with red, puffy eyes. She said she heard me on the phone with my lawyer earlier talking about the case and the restraining order hearing. She asked why the lady hated us so much and why we couldn't just move somewhere else where people were nice. She said she missed her old neighborhood where nobody cared what color anyone was and kids just played together without their parents making it weird. She asked if it was her fault that Nancy didn't like us because of how she looked. That question broke my heart into a million pieces. My 7-year-old daughter was blaming herself for a grown woman's racism. I pulled her into a hug and told her none of this was her fault, that Nancy had problems that had nothing to do with Lily or how beautiful she was. But I could tell Lily didn't really believe me. She'd been carrying this weight around for months, thinking maybe if she looked different or acted different, Nancy would leave us alone. The next morning, I took Lily to her therapy appointment. The therapist had been seeing her twice a month since the CPS investigation traumatized her at the school. We sat in the waiting room with its boring magazines and fake plants until the therapist called us back. She talked to Lily alone for 30 minutes while I waited outside. Then she asked me to come in for the last part of the session. The therapist chose her words carefully, but her message was clear. She said, continuing this conflict with Nancy might actually be causing more harm to Lily than Nancy's original harassment did. She pointed out that Lily's anxiety had gotten worse over the past month, not better. The nightmares were back. The withdrawn behavior at the school was new. Lily was starting to see herself as the cause of adult problems instead of just being a kid. The therapist said Lily needed stability and peace more than she needed to see her father win a battle against a racist neighbor. She suggested that sometimes protecting your child means choosing to disengage from fights you have every right to win. I sat there feeling defensive and ashamed at the same time. Defensive because I was standing up for my family against real discrimination. Ashamed because maybe I'd let my need for justice override my daughter's need for normalcy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about whether my need for Nancy to face consequences was worth what it was costing Lily emotionally. The question kept spinning through my head in circles. I didn't want to teach my daughter that backing down from racism was the answer. I didn't want her to grow up thinking we should just accept discrimination and harassment to keep the peace. But I also didn't want to sacrifice her childhood to prove a point to a neighbor who would probably never change anyway. I thought about my wife and what she would want me to do. She always said, pick your battles carefully and make sure the fight is worth what it costs your family. I wasn't sure anymore if this fight was worth the price Lily was paying. She'd already lost her mom. Now she was losing her sense of safety and belonging because I couldn't let go of making Nancy suffer for what she did to us. Maybe I'd already won enough by exposing Nancy's racism and getting her fired. Maybe continuing to engage was just feeding my own anger instead of protecting my daughter. The neighborhood gossip chain brought me the news 3 days later. Margaret from across the street knocked on my door in the afternoon and told me Nancy's real estate firm had completed their investigation. They terminated Nancy's employment that morning. The official reason was violating fair housing laws and creating liability for the company. Margaret heard about it from another neighbor who heard it from someone who worked at the same firm. Word traveled fast on our street when something dramatic happened. I felt this surge of satisfaction hearing Nancy lost her job. She'd spent months trying to destroy my life, and now her career was over because of her own actions. Justice felt good for about 10 seconds. Then the satisfaction turned into something else. Unease, worry, guilt maybe. Nancy just lost her income and her professional reputation. She was probably spiraling into desperation. Desperate people do unpredictable things. I wondered if getting her fired would finally end this, or if it would just make her more dangerous. 2 days after I heard Nancy lost her job, I walked out to my car in the morning to drive Lily to the school and saw the damage right away. Someone had keyed the entire driver's side, deep scratches running from the front door all the way to the back bumper. But that wasn't the worst part. They'd scratched a racist slur into the hood, the letters big enough to read from the street. I stood there staring at it while my stomach turned over. Lily came running out with her backpack and stopped when she saw my face. She asked what was wrong, and I told her to go back inside. She looked at the car and saw the word before I could block her view. Her face went pale and she asked me what it meant. I took her hand and walked her back to the house, telling her it was just a bad word that mean people use. I called the police and filed a report while Lily ate breakfast inside. The officer who came out took photos and wrote everything down, but told me straight up that without witnesses or cameras, they probably wouldn't find who did it. He asked if I had any idea who might have done this. I told him about Nancy losing her job 2 days ago. He wrote that down too, but said timing wasn't proof. After he left, I called my insurance company and arranged to get the car fixed. Then I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and trying to figure out what to tell Lily's school about why she'd be late. The whole time I kept thinking about Nancy and whether she'd actually done this, or if it was just convenient timing. Part of me wanted it to be her, because then at least I'd know who I was dealing with. But another part of me hoped it wasn't, because if Nancy had escalated to property damage and racist vandalism, things were about to get a lot worse before they got better. I spent the rest of that day making arrangements to get my car fixed and trying not to think about what it meant that my daughter had seen that word scratched into our car in our own driveway. The insurance company said they'd cover it, but I'd have to pay the $500 deductible. $500 because Nancy couldn't handle being held accountable for her racism. I dropped Lily off at the school late, and she asked me 3 times if we were safe at home. Each time she asked, something twisted tighter in my chest. This was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid when we moved here after my wife died. I wanted Lily to feel safe and normal and like a regular kid. Instead, she was asking her dad if they were safe in their own house because some neighbor had terrorized us for months, and now someone had vandalized our car with a racial slur. I picked Lily up from the school that afternoon, and she was quiet the whole drive home. When we got to the house, she didn't want to play outside. She sat on the couch with her tablet and kept looking out the front window like she was watching for something. I made dinner, and she barely ate. That night, when I tucked her into bed, she asked if the person who scratched our car was going to come back. I told her no, that it was probably just one time, but I didn't know if I believed that myself. After she fell asleep, I sat in the living room with all the lights off and watched the street through the window. Every car that drove by made me tense up. Every shadow moving in a neighbor's yard made me wonder if Nancy was out there planning her next move. The next morning, Lily came into my room before my alarm went off and asked if we could stay at Amy and Terrell's house for a while. She said she didn't feel safe at home anymore. I sat up in bed and looked at my 7-year-old daughter standing there in her pajamas with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, and something broke inside me. We'd moved to this neighborhood for a fresh start after losing her mom. We'd picked this house specifically because it felt safe and welcoming. Now my daughter was asking to leave because she didn't feel safe here anymore. I pulled her onto the bed and hugged her and told her we'd figure something out. She asked if we could go today, and I said I'd call Amy after breakfast. We ate cereal in silence, and then I called my sister-in-law while Lily packed a bag in her room. Amy answered on the second ring, and I explained what happened with the car and what Lily had just asked me. Amy didn't hesitate. She said to bring Lily over right away, and we could stay as long as we needed. I thanked her and hung up and helped Lily finish packing. We drove to Amy and Terrell's house across town, and Lily perked up a little when her cousins ran out to greet her. Amy took Lily inside with the kids, while Terrell walked me back to my car. He asked how I was holding up, and I told him honestly that I wasn't sure anymore. He put his hand on my shoulder and said we'd figure this out together. I drove back to our house alone and spent the afternoon working from home and trying not to think about how empty the place felt, without Lily's noise filling it up. Around 3 in the afternoon, the woman who lived across the street knocked on my door. Her name was something I couldn't remember, but she'd always been friendly enough, waving when we saw each other outside. She stood on my porch looking uncomfortable and asked if she could talk to me for a minute. I let her in, and she sat on the edge of my couch like she wasn't planning to stay long. She told me she'd heard about what happened with Nancy losing her job and about my car getting vandalized. Then she said something that made me stop and actually listen. She said Nancy's husband had died 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack. He'd been out mowing the lawn one Saturday morning and just collapsed. By the time the ambulance got there, he was gone. After that, Nancy had become different, more watchful, more controlling about the neighborhood. She'd apparently called the police on several neighbors over the years for minor things like parking too close to her driveway or having their trash cans out too early. The woman said Nancy had always been a little uptight, but losing her husband had made her worse, like she was trying to control everything around her because she couldn't control what happened to her family. She said she wasn't excusing Nancy's behavior toward me and Lily, but she thought I should know there was more to Nancy's story than just racism. After she left, I sat there thinking about what she'd told me. The information about Nancy's dead husband sat in my head for the rest of the day, making everything more complicated than I wanted it to be. It would have been easier to keep seeing Nancy as just a racist neighbor who got what she deserved, but now I knew she was also a widow who'd watched her husband die suddenly and had apparently dealt with that trauma by becoming the worst version of herself. I thought about how I dealt with my wife's death by moving us to a new neighborhood, trying to control our environment and make everything safe and predictable for Lily. Nancy had dealt with her loss by trying to control her environment too, but her way of doing that had involved harassment and racism and making my daughter's life hell. We were both single parents who'd lost our spouses, both trying to protect our sense of security in a world that had proven it could take everything away without warning, both making choices that hurt other people in the process. The difference was that my choices came from trying to protect my daughter from a real threat, while Nancy's choices came from seeing threats that didn't exist. Or maybe she saw real threats, but aimed her fear at the wrong target. Either way, knowing her backstory didn't excuse what she'd done to us, but it made her slightly more human and complicated in my mind. I didn't want to feel empathy for Nancy. I wanted to stay angry at her for terrorizing my daughter and calling CPS and making Lily ask why someone wanted to take her away from me. But I couldn't stop thinking about how grief had twisted both of us into people who were willing to hurt others to feel safe again. My lawyer called the next afternoon while I was sitting at Amy and Terrell's kitchen table trying to work. She said Nancy's attorney had reached out about settling the potential lawsuit. Nancy was offering to drop all her legal threats if I agreed not to pursue any further action against her. It was basically a mutual ceasefire proposal. Both sides walk away and leave each other alone. My lawyer said she thought I should seriously consider it. She reminded me that continuing this fight would mean more legal fees, more time in court, more stress for Lily. She pointed out that Nancy had already faced real consequences by losing her job and her professional reputation. The real estate board investigation was still ongoing and would proceed regardless of what I decided to do. My lawyer said sometimes the best outcome isn't total victory. It's getting enough justice to feel vindicated while protecting yourself from further damage. I told her I'd think about it and call her back. After I hung up, I sat there staring at my laptop screen without seeing anything on it. Part of me wanted to reject the settlement and keep fighting until Nancy paid for every single thing she'd done to us. But another part of me was tired of fighting and worried about what this ongoing conflict was doing to Lily. That evening, I talked to Terrell and Amy about the settlement offer after the kids went to bed. We sat in their living room and I laid out all the options and consequences. Terrell listened and then asked me what my wife would have wanted me to do. I sat there thinking about all the conversations we'd had about raising a mixed-race kid in America, all the times she'd reminded me to pick my battles carefully. Amy leaned forward and said I'd already accomplished the goal of making Nancy face professional consequences. She pointed out that Nancy had lost her job and her reputation and was probably going to lose her real estate license. Amy said continuing the fight at this point wasn't about justice anymore. It was about revenge, and revenge was hurting Lily more than it was hurting Nancy. Terrell agreed and reminded me that Lily was asking to stay at their house because she didn't feel safe at home. He said the conflict had already cost Lily her sense of security, and if I kept pushing, it might cost her even more. I knew they were right, but I hated admitting it. I'd spent months dealing with Nancy's harassment, and I'd finally gotten the upper hand. Walking away from that felt like losing, even though logically, I knew it was the smart choice. Amy reached over and squeezed my hand and told me that sometimes being a good parent means swallowing your pride and choosing what's best for your kid over what feels satisfying for yourself. That night, I couldn't sleep at Amy and Terrell's house. I lay on their guest room bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had happened since we moved to the neighborhood in April. My wife had been gone for over a year now, and I still found myself wanting to ask her what to do in situations like this. She'd always been better at seeing the bigger picture while I got caught up in the immediate fight. I got up around 2 in the morning and walked down the hall to the room where Lily was sleeping with her cousins. I stood in the doorway watching her sleep, her face peaceful, in a way it hadn't been at our house in weeks. I thought about all the times my wife and I had talked about the challenges Lily would face growing up as a mixed-race kid. We'd agreed we'd teach her to stand up for herself and not accept discrimination. But my wife had also always said to pick your battles carefully and make sure the fight is worth what it costs your family. I'd been so focused on making Nancy pay for what she did that I hadn't stopped to consider what the ongoing fight was costing Lily. The answer was right there in front of me. It was costing her the ability to sleep peacefully in her own bed in her own house. It was costing her the sense of safety and belonging we'd moved to that neighborhood to find. My wife would have told me that I'd already won the important battle by exposing Nancy's racism and getting her fired. She would have said that continuing to fight was about my ego now, not about protecting our daughter. I decided to accept the settlement offer the next morning. I called my lawyer before Lily woke up and told her to contact Nancy's attorney and work out the details. It felt like losing and winning at the same time, which I was learning is what most real-life resolutions actually feel like. You don't get the satisfying ending where the bad guy gets completely destroyed and everyone lives happily ever after. You get complicated compromises where nobody gets everything they want, but hopefully everyone gets enough to move forward. My lawyer said she'd draw up the agreement and have it ready to sign by the end of the week. I thanked her and hung up and made breakfast for Lily and her cousins. Lily came into the kitchen and asked if we could go home today. I told her maybe in a few days, after I got some things sorted out. She nodded and ate her cereal, and I watched her and wondered if I'd made the right choice. The only way I'd know for sure was to see how things played out from here. The week after we signed the settlement agreement, Lily had a particularly bad therapy session. The therapist called me afterward and asked if I could come in to talk. I drove over there during my lunch break and sat in her office while she explained what had happened. Lily had spent most of the session talking about feeling like the conflict with Nancy was her fault because of how she looks. She'd told the therapist that if she looked more like me, Nancy wouldn't have thought I kidnapped her, and none of this would have happened. The therapist said Lily was internalizing the situation as being about her appearance rather than about Nancy's racism. She was blaming herself for having blonde hair and blue eyes, instead of understanding that the problem was Nancy's prejudice and fear. Hearing that my daughter had internalized this conflict as her fault made me feel sick. I'd spent months fighting to prove that Nancy was wrong about us, but somehow Lily had ended up thinking she was the problem. The therapist said this was actually pretty common with kids in situations like ours. They don't have the life experience to understand systemic racism or adult prejudice, so they look for explanations that make sense to them, and often that means blaming themselves. She said the fact that I'd chosen to end the legal battle and focus on Lily's well-being was exactly the right move. She told me that over time, with continued therapy and support, Lily would learn to understand that Nancy's actions were never about her. But right now, ending the conflict and giving Lily stability was the most important thing I could do. I drove to the grocery store 3 days after signing the settlement papers, needing milk and bread for Lily's lunches. The place was mostly empty on a Tuesday morning, which meant I could get in and out fast without running into anyone from the neighborhood. I grabbed a cart and headed toward the dairy section, mentally running through what else we needed at home. I turned down the cereal aisle and there she was. Nancy stood about 15 feet away, holding a box of granola and staring at the nutrition label like it contained the secrets of the universe. My whole body went stiff and I stopped moving, one hand still on the cart handle. She looked up at the same moment and our eyes met. For about 3 seconds we both just stood there frozen, two people who'd spent months making each other's lives terrible, now trapped in the same aisle of a suburban grocery store. Nancy's face went through several expressions real fast, starting with surprise and ending somewhere around uncomfortable recognition. I nodded once, just a quick dip of my chin, not friendly, but not hostile either. She nodded back the same way, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Then we both turned and walked in opposite directions without saying a word. My heart was beating hard as I pushed my cart toward the dairy coolers, and I realized my hands were shaking slightly on the handle. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt much longer, like time had stretched out to make the awkwardness last as long as possible. I grabbed the milk and got out of there, checking over my shoulder to make sure Nancy wasn't in the checkout line before I headed that way myself. My phone rang 2 days later while I was working at my desk, and Mr. Hutchinson's name showed up on the screen. I answered, and he asked how we were doing, his voice warm and genuinely interested. I told him things were settling down now that the legal stuff was over. He said he was glad to hear it, and then mentioned he'd successfully sold his mansion the previous week through a different realtor who treated everyone with respect, regardless of what they looked like. The sale went through without any issues, and the new owners were moving in next month. I congratulated him, and he thanked me again for exposing what kind of person Nancy really was. He said, if I hadn't organized that open house, he would have trusted her with the biggest financial transaction of his life and never known she was discriminating against potential buyers. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. The real estate board investigation was still moving forward, even though Nancy and I had settled our personal lawsuit. Apparently, the board took fair housing violations seriously, and they were conducting their own review of Nancy's conduct, independent of any private legal action. Mr. Hutchinson said he'd given them a full statement about what happened at the open house, and they'd interviewed several of the families who attended. He wanted me to know that Nancy facing professional consequences wasn't just about our personal conflict anymore. It was about protecting other families from experiencing what we went through. I thanked him for the update, and we talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. After the call ended, I sat at my desk thinking about how the situation had grown beyond just me and Nancy into something bigger about accountability and protecting people from discrimination. Lily's teacher called me the following week and asked if I had a few minutes to talk about how Lily was doing in class. My stomach dropped because every phone call from the school for the past few months had been bad news. But the teacher's voice sounded positive, not concerned, so I took a breath and said sure. She told me Lily had been participating more in class discussions over the past 2 weeks, raising her hand to answer questions and volunteering to read aloud during story time. Her homework was coming in complete and on time, and she'd been playing with her friends at recess instead of sitting by herself like she had been. The teacher said Lily seemed less anxious overall, more like the engaged student she'd been at the beginning of the school year before everything happened with Nancy. I felt relief wash over me as I listened, realizing that ending the legal battle had been the right choice, even though it felt like giving up at the time. The teacher asked if anything had changed at home that might explain Lily's improvement, and I told her we'd settled the conflict with our neighbor, and things were much calmer now. She said she could definitely see the difference in Lily's behavior and mood. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about what winning actually meant. I hadn't gotten the total victory over Nancy that part of me still wanted, where she faced maximum consequences and admitted she was completely wrong. But I was winning at being Lily's dad by choosing her stability over my need for vindication. She was sleeping through the night again, engaging at the school, playing with friends. Those things mattered more than any lawsuit or public humiliation of Nancy ever could. My daughter was okay, and that meant I'd won the important battle, even if it didn't feel satisfying in the way I'd imagined. Over the next week, 3 different neighbors stopped by my house at separate times. The first was the guy who lived 4 houses down, the one who always waved but never really talked much. He showed up on a Wednesday evening and apologized for not being more supportive when Nancy was harassing us. He said he'd seen some of what was happening, but didn't want to get involved in neighborhood drama, and now he realized that staying neutral when someone is being harassed is actually taking the harasser's side. 2 days later, the woman from across the street came by with the same message. She'd witnessed Nancy following us to the bus stop and taking pictures, but told herself it wasn't her business. Now she understood that silence in the face of racism makes you part of the problem. The third neighbor was someone I barely knew from the end of the street. She apologized for initially believing Nancy's version of events when she posted in the neighborhood Facebook group. She said she should have talked to me directly instead of assuming Nancy was telling the truth just because she'd lived here longer. All 3 conversations followed the same basic pattern, people explaining they'd been uncomfortable with the conflict and chose not to get involved, then realizing later that their neutrality had actually helped Nancy continue her harassment. I appreciated the apologies, even though part of me was frustrated it took so long for people to speak up. But I also understood that most people avoid conflict when they can, and it takes something big to make them realize that avoiding conflict sometimes means allowing harm to continue. 6 weeks after Nancy lost her job at the real estate firm, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard. I was walking Lily to the bus stop when I noticed it, and my first reaction was relief that she'd be leaving the neighborhood. My second reaction was guilt about whether I'd pushed too hard and destroyed her life over what started as her racist assumptions about my family. I spent the whole day going back and forth between feeling like she deserved what happened and wondering if the punishment fit the crime. That evening I called my lawyer and told her about seeing the for sale sign. She reminded me that Nancy had made her own choices every step of the way. Nobody forced her to call the police 4 times or contact CPS or make discriminatory comments to potential homebuyers. Those were all decisions Nancy made, and the consequences she was facing were natural results of her actions, not punishment I'd imposed on her. My lawyer said Nancy could have stopped at any point, could have apologized and changed her behavior, but she chose to escalate instead. The fact that her choices led to losing her job and having to sell her house didn't make me responsible for those outcomes. I knew she was right, but it still felt complicated, like I'd won a battle I wasn't entirely comfortable winning. 2 weeks later, a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway on a Saturday afternoon. A woman maybe in her 30s got out, and I watched from the window as she walked up to my front door. I opened it before she could knock, and she introduced herself as Nancy's daughter, visiting from out of state to help her mom prepare for the move. She asked if she could talk to me for a few minutes, and I said, okay, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind me so Lily wouldn't overhear. Nancy's daughter apologized for her mother's behavior, saying she'd been horrified when she learned what her mom had done to our family. She explained that Nancy had been struggling with anxiety and control issues since her dad died 4 years ago, becoming increasingly focused on monitoring the neighborhood and feeling like she needed to protect it from perceived threats. The daughter said her mom had always had some prejudiced views, but they'd gotten worse after her husband's death, like she was looking for someone to blame for feeling unsafe in the world. She wanted me to know that Nancy was getting professional help now, seeing a therapist who specialized in grief and anxiety, and starting to understand how her fear had turned into racism that hurt innocent people. The daughter stressed that none of this excused what Nancy did, but she hoped it helped me understand that her mom wasn't just a purely evil person. She was someone who dealt with loss in the worst possible way. I listened to all of this and didn't know what to say. Part of me appreciated the apology and the context. Part of me was angry that I was supposed to feel sympathy for Nancy when she'd terrorized my daughter. I thanked the daughter for coming by and told her I hoped her mother got the help she needed, and I meant it, even though my feelings were complicated. Nancy's daughter's visit stayed with me for days afterward, making me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't quite explain. It was easier to hate Nancy when she was just the racist neighbor who called the cops on my family. Learning about her dead husband and her anxiety and her therapy sessions made her human in a way that complicated my anger. I didn't want to feel sympathy for someone who'd caused Lily so much pain, but I also couldn't ignore that Nancy was a person dealing with her own struggles in terrible ways. I found myself thinking about my wife and how we'd both dealt with her cancer diagnosis. I'd tried to be strong and supportive while she was sick, but after she died, I'd gone through a period where I was angry at everything and everyone. I'd never turned that anger into racism, but I understood how grief could twist someone's thinking and make them act in ways they might not have otherwise. That didn't excuse Nancy's behavior, but it made me see her as more than just a villain in our story. She was a widow who'd lost her way and hurt people in the process, and now she was facing consequences while also trying to get help. The whole situation felt messy and complicated instead of clean and simple, like I'd wanted it to be. 3 days after Nancy's daughter visited, she called and asked if Nancy could apologize to Lily directly before they moved. Every instinct I had screamed to protect Lily from any more contact with the woman who'd scared her so badly. I said I needed to think about it and talk to Lily's therapist first. At our next session, I brought up the request, and the therapist asked what I thought. I said I wanted to keep Nancy as far away from my daughter as possible. The therapist nodded and then suggested that hearing a direct apology from Nancy might actually give Lily closure and help her understand that Nancy's behavior wasn't about anything Lily did wrong. She said kids who experience this kind of targeting often internalize it and blame themselves, and seeing the adult take full accountability could help Lily separate Nancy's actions from her own identity. I wasn't convinced at first, but the therapist explained how the apology session would work. It would happen in her office with her present the whole time, and I could stop it at any moment if Lily seemed uncomfortable. Nancy would apologize and explain that her behavior was wrong and had nothing to do with Lily. Then Lily could respond however she wanted, or not respond at all if she didn't want to. The therapist said she'd only recommend this if she thought it would help Lily, not hurt her. I talked to Lily about it that evening, explaining that Nancy wanted to say sorry and asking if Lily wanted to hear it. Lily thought for a minute and then said yes, she wanted Nancy to say sorry. So I called Nancy's daughter back and agreed to a supervised meeting at the therapist's office the following week. The day of the apology session, I drove Lily to the therapist's office with my stomach in knots. Nancy was already there when we arrived, sitting in the waiting room looking smaller and older than I remembered. We all went into the therapist's office and sat down, me next to Lily on the couch, Nancy in a chair across from us, the therapist in her usual spot. Nancy looked at Lily and apologized for scaring her, and for all the times she called the police, and for making Lily feel unsafe in her own home. She told Lily that her behavior was completely wrong and had nothing to do with anything Lily did or how Lily looked. Nancy said she'd been dealing with her own problems and fears, and she'd handled them in terrible ways that hurt innocent people. She told Lily she was getting help now, so she wouldn't treat anyone else the way she'd treated our family. Then Nancy said she understood if Lily couldn't forgive her, but she wanted Lily to know that none of it was Lily's fault. The whole time Nancy was talking, I watched Lily's face for signs of distress, ready to end the session if needed. But Lily just sat there listening calmly, her hands folded in her lap. When Nancy finished, Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said she forgave Nancy, but didn't want to be friends. The maturity in that response amazed me. My 7-year-old daughter had just accepted an apology while also setting a clear boundary about what she was and wasn't willing to offer. Nancy thanked Lily and said she understood. The whole session lasted maybe 15 minutes, and then Nancy left, and it was just me and Lily and the therapist. After Nancy walked out, the therapist asked Lily how she felt. Lily said she felt better, like something heavy had been sitting on her chest, and now it was gone. She said hearing Nancy say it wasn't her fault made her believe it more than when other people told her the same thing. The therapist smiled and told Lily she'd handled the situation with real grace and strength. We talked for a few more minutes and then headed home. In the car, Lily seemed lighter somehow, looking out the window and humming along to the radio instead of sitting quiet and tense like she'd been for months. That evening, she played in the backyard for an hour, running around and laughing in a way I hadn't seen since before all this started. At bedtime, she hugged me extra tight and said she was glad we didn't have to worry about Nancy anymore. After I tucked her in, the therapist called to check in. She told me that witnessing Nancy take accountability had helped Lily understand that the problem was never about her or our family, it was about Nancy's issues. She said kids need to see adults own their mistakes and apologize sincerely, and that experience had given Lily an important lesson about accountability and forgiveness that would serve her well as she grew up. The for sale sign went up in front of Nancy's house less than a week after the settlement agreement got signed. I saw it from my living room window while making coffee one morning and felt something twist in my chest that wasn't quite satisfaction or relief. Just 2 weeks later, a young couple pulled up in a moving truck on a Saturday afternoon. The woman was black, the guy was white, and they had a baby strapped to the woman's chest in one of those carrier things. I watched them from my porch as they stood on the sidewalk looking up at the house, the guy pointing at something on the roof, while the woman bounced the baby and nodded. They spotted me watching and waved, so I walked over to introduce myself. The woman's name was Jasmine, and her husband was Chris, and their baby girl couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Jasmine mentioned they'd heard there was some drama on the street recently, but they wanted to start fresh with everyone and hoped the neighborhood would be welcoming. I told them welcome to the street and offered to help them move boxes if they needed it. Chris asked if I knew anything about the previous owner and why she sold so fast, and I just said she was relocating for family reasons and left it at that. Jasmine smiled and said that was good because they didn't need any negative energy in their new home, and I thought about how Nancy would have lost her mind seeing this family move into her house. The baby started fussing, and Jasmine excused herself to go feed her, and Chris thanked me again for the warm welcome before heading back to unpack the truck. Walking back to my house, I made a decision not to tell them the full story about Nancy or keep the conflict alive by gossiping about what happened. They seemed like good people trying to make a home, and their baby was adorable with these huge brown eyes, and I wanted to focus on that instead of dwelling on everything with Nancy. Lily came outside and asked who the new neighbors were, and I told her a nice family with a baby just moved in, and she got excited about maybe babysitting when she got older. 3 days after Jasmine and Chris moved in, Mr. Hutchinson called me around dinner time. He asked how things were going and if I'd noticed Nancy's house sold, and I told him, yeah, nice young family bought it. He was quiet for a second, and then said he had news about the state real estate board investigation. They'd completed their review and decided to suspend Nancy's license for 2 years and require ethics training before she could even apply for reinstatement. Mr. Hutchinson said the board took it seriously because of the fair housing violations and the pattern of discriminatory behavior he'd documented in his complaint. He also mentioned Nancy was moving to another state to live near her daughter and start over somewhere nobody knew about what happened. I thanked him for following through with the complaint and for calling to let me know, and he said he was glad things worked out and hoped my daughter was doing better. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table thinking about Nancy losing her license and having to move away and start completely over. Part of me felt vindicated that there were real consequences for what she did to us, but another part felt weird about how thoroughly her life had fallen apart. I kept thinking about what her daughter told me about Nancy struggling with grief and control issues, and how Nancy had lost her husband, the same way I lost my wife. It didn't excuse the racism or the harassment or traumatizing Lily, but it made Nancy feel more like a broken person than a monster, and that complicated feeling sat heavy in my stomach. 3 months passed after the open house incident, and life slowly settled into something that felt almost normal. Lily stopped asking if we had to move and started sleeping through the night again without nightmares. Her grades came back up at the school, and her teacher sent home a note saying Lily seemed much happier and more engaged in class. I stopped checking the windows every time I heard a car door or looking over my shoulder when we walked to the bus stop. The neighborhood felt peaceful in a way it hadn't since we first moved in, back before Nancy made everything tense and hostile. Several families on the street became genuine friends instead of just people we waved to. The couple across the street invited us over for a barbecue, and Jasmine and Chris from Nancy's old house started joining our weekend morning coffee chats on the sidewalk. Lily made friends with 3 kids from different families on our block, and they'd ride bikes together in the evenings, while parents stood around talking. Nobody mentioned Nancy anymore, and the drama faded into something that happened in the past instead of defining our present. I caught myself relaxing in ways I hadn't been able to since my wife died, like maybe we'd actually found the fresh start I wanted for us when we moved here. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the garage organizing tools when I heard Lily laughing in the backyard with another kid. I walked around the side of the house and saw her playing with a girl about her age who I didn't recognize. The girl had dark curly hair and was wearing a soccer jersey, and both kids were kicking a ball back and forth. Lily spotted me and ran over saying this was her new best friend Olivia, whose family just moved to the neighborhood last week. Olivia waved at me shyly, and I waved back. Then Lily grabbed my hand and pulled me over to meet Olivia properly. Olivia's parents had bought the house at the end of the street that had been empty for months, and Olivia was in Lily's class at the school, but they'd only just realized they lived on the same street. Watching Lily play with Olivia without any fear or anxiety reminded me why we moved here in the first place. My daughter was running around laughing, completely carefree, not worried about who was watching or what anyone thought about our family. The fresh start I wanted for us after my wife's death finally felt like it was actually happening, instead of just something I hoped for. Olivia's mom came by to pick her up an hour later and introduced herself as Sophia, and we made plans for the girls to have a play date the following weekend. After they left, Lily hugged me and said she was glad we didn't move away when things got bad with Nancy, and I hugged her back, thinking about how close I came to giving up on this neighborhood. The next Sunday, I took Lily to visit her mom's grave like we did every few weeks. We brought fresh flowers, and Lily helped me arrange them in the vase built into the headstone. We sat on the grass next to the grave, and I asked Lily if she wanted to talk to her mom about anything. Lily was quiet for a minute, and then started telling her mom about everything that happened with Nancy, about being scared and going to therapy, and how the mean lady finally moved away. She told her mom about her new friend Olivia and the block parties, and how the neighborhood felt safe now. Then Lily looked at me and said she thought her mom would be proud of me for standing up for them, but also for knowing when to stop fighting. I asked her what she meant, and Lily said her mom always told her that being strong meant knowing when to walk away from fights that weren't worth it, and I'd been strong by protecting us, but also by accepting Nancy's apology and letting things end peacefully. Sitting there listening to my 7-year-old daughter explain this situation with more wisdom than I'd shown through most of it, I realized she understood what happened better than I gave her credit for. She understood that I'd needed to stand up to Nancy, but also that continuing to fight would have hurt us more than it hurt Nancy. I told Lily her mom would be proud of both of us, and we sat there for a while longer, just being quiet together. The therapy sessions with Lily's counselor gradually tapered off from weekly to every other week to once a month as Lily's anxiety decreased. She was processing her feelings in healthier ways, and the nightmares had stopped completely. At our last session, the therapist told me that children are remarkably resilient when they feel safe and supported, and Lily clearly felt both of those things now. She said the work we'd done in therapy gave Lily tools to handle difficult situations and emotions, and she was confident Lily would continue to thrive. The therapist also mentioned that witnessing the conflict with Nancy and seeing how we resolved it had taught Lily important lessons about standing up for yourself, setting boundaries, and choosing peace when possible. She said those lessons would serve Lily well as she grew up and faced other challenges. Walking out of the therapist's office for what might be our last regular session, I felt grateful that we'd gotten Lily the help she needed and hadn't tried to just tough it out. My daughter was happy and healthy and felt safe in her own home again, and that mattered more than anything else that happened with Nancy. 4 months after Nancy moved away, the neighborhood organized a block party for the 4th of July. Someone set up grills on the street, and families brought food to share, and kids ran around with sparklers as it got dark. Standing there with a plate of potato salad watching Lily play with Olivia and the other neighborhood kids, I was struck by how different the atmosphere felt, without Nancy's surveillance and hostility. Families of all backgrounds were mixing comfortably, laughing and talking and sharing food without any tension or judgment. Black families, white families, mixed families, families with adopted kids, everyone just existing together without anyone questioning whether they belonged. I realized the community was healthier, without someone actively poisoning it with prejudice and suspicion. Jasmine came over with her baby, and we talked about how welcoming everyone had been since they moved in, and she said she'd been worried about being accepted, but this neighborhood felt like home already. Chris joined us and mentioned he'd heard there used to be someone on the street who caused problems, but everyone seemed great now, and I just nodded and said, yeah, things were pretty peaceful these days. The fireworks started and everyone gathered to watch, and I stood there with Lily on my shoulders, feeling like we'd finally found the place we were supposed to be. During the block party, Zoe's mom pulled me aside near the drink table and thanked me for how I'd handled the situation with Nancy. I was confused at first because I hadn't done anything special, but she explained that the whole conflict had forced her to examine her own biases and have important conversations with her daughter about racism. She said when Nancy first called her with those lies about me, she'd had a moment of doubt where she wondered if there was any truth to it. And realizing she'd doubted me based on nothing but Nancy's racist assumptions made her confront her own internalized prejudices. She'd talked to Zoe about why Nancy's behavior was wrong and why it was important to question your assumptions about people based on how they look. Then she told me several other parents had said the same thing, that watching the conflict unfold and seeing Nancy face consequences had sparked necessary discussions in their homes about racism and discrimination. Her teenage son had asked why Nancy cared so much about me being black, and that led to a whole conversation about systemic racism and unconscious bias. She thanked me for not backing down and for making the neighborhood confront something people usually preferred to ignore. I told her I appreciated that, but honestly, I'd just been trying to protect my daughter, and she said sometimes the most important changes happen when people are just trying to do right by their families. Later that night, after the block party ended and Lily was in bed, I called Terrell and Amy to catch up. We talked about the neighborhood and how things had settled down, and they mentioned they were planning to visit next month. Terrell asked if I still kept in touch with Kenji and Luis and the other families from our old neighborhood, and I realized I'd barely talked to any of them since the open house incident. I'd been so focused on establishing ourselves in the new neighborhood that I'd let those relationships drift. But thinking about it more, I realized I didn't need to maintain those relationships out of fear anymore. When we first moved, I'd clung to connections from our old life because I was worried about whether we'd be accepted here. Now we had a new community that knew us and accepted us without question, and I didn't need a backup plan or an escape route. We'd moved for a fresh start, and we'd actually achieved it, built genuine friendships with people who saw us as neighbors and friends, instead of as the black dad with the white daughter who needed explaining. I told Terrell I'd probably reach out to Kenji and the others eventually, but right now, I was just enjoying being settled, and he laughed and said that was exactly how it should be. A month after the therapy sessions tapered off, I got a call from Lily's teacher asking if I could come in for a quick meeting. My stomach dropped, because the last time a teacher called me in, it was to tell me about the CPS worker pulling Lily out of class. I showed up the next afternoon expecting bad news, but her teacher smiled when I walked into the classroom. She told me Lily's performance had improved dramatically over the past few weeks. Her reading scores jumped 2 grade levels, she was participating more in class discussions, and she seemed genuinely happy during school hours. The teacher said she'd been working with kids for 15 years and could always tell when a child was carrying stress at home, and whatever weight Lily had been carrying was completely gone now. I sat there listening and realized that protecting my daughter's peace had been worth more than any victory over Nancy could have been. The teacher showed me Lily's recent assignments, including a creative writing piece about her favorite place, which was our front yard where she could play without worrying. I thanked the teacher and walked out to my car feeling like I'd finally made the right choice by ending the legal battle when I did. 6 months after everything started with Nancy's first police call, I was sitting on my front porch on a Saturday afternoon watching Lily play in the yard. She was doing cartwheels and singing some song from a movie, completely carefree and unself-conscious. I wasn't checking over my shoulder to see if anyone was watching or taking pictures. I wasn't worried about who might call the cops or what lies might be spreading through the neighborhood. The anxiety that had lived in my chest for months was just gone. Lily ran up to the porch and asked if she could ride her bike to the end of the street and back, and I said yes, without that split second of fear about whether someone would question why a black man was letting a white girl ride a bike. The neighborhood felt like home now, in a way it hadn't even before Nancy started her harassment campaign. I'd learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose peace over being right, and sitting there watching my daughter play freely was proof that I'd made the right call. The following Tuesday, I got a letter in the mail with unfamiliar handwriting on the envelope. It was from Nancy's daughter, the one who'd visited to apologize before they moved. She wrote that her mom was doing better in therapy and working through the grief and fear that drove her worst behavior. The letter explained that Nancy had been diagnosed with anxiety disorder and PTSD related to her husband's sudden death, and the therapy was helping her understand how she'd projected her need for control onto our family. Nancy's daughter thanked me for giving her mom a chance to apologize to Lily directly, saying it was an important step in her mother's healing process. She wrote that Nancy talks about that apology session often, and how Lily's forgiveness, even though she didn't want to be friends, meant more than Nancy could express. I read the letter twice and felt a complicated mix of emotions. I appreciated knowing Nancy was getting help and taking accountability, but I also knew Nancy and I would never be friends or even friendly neighbors if she ever moved back. The letter went into a drawer in my desk, and I decided that was enough closure for that chapter. That weekend, Lily and I were out in the front garden planting flowers where we planned to stay for years to come. She picked out purple and yellow flowers at the garden center because they reminded her of her mom's favorite colors. We dug holes and filled them with soil, and Lily carefully placed each plant like it was the most important thing in the world. I thought about how this whole experience had taught both of us that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean fighting until total victory. Sometimes it means protecting what matters most, accepting imperfect resolutions, and building the life you want despite the obstacles. Lily asked if we could plant a sunflower in the back corner for her mom, and we walked around back together to find the perfect spot. As we worked in the garden, neighbors walked by and waved, and Lily waved back without any hesitation or fear. We were doing exactly what we moved here to do, living our lives and making a home, and that was enough.